So, welcome everyone. I'm really happy to have you guys here back. If you guys don't know me, I'm Fernando Redivo. I'm the executive assistant for the System Dynamics Society. And today we're here to talk about housing dynamics. And I really hope that by the end of this webinar, you guys learn a little bit more of the aspects of the housing dynamics. We have three great presenters today coming from different countries. So we're having an overview of different realities and also different approaches. We have system dynamics, but also systems thinking and systems mapping. So this is going to be a really insightful webinar. And for you guys who are not members of the society yet, or you guys are members and don't remember all the benefits of being a member of the society, you get free access to all society seminar series, such as this one. You got a great discount of our honor conference. Here says it's 2021, but it's actually 2022. We're meeting in Frankfurt next year. You get full access to our scientific journal, the System Dynamics Review, exclusive prices on our bookshop. And you also, if you're planning to learn more system dynamics, you get access to a pool of mentors and free access to our society networking series. So don't miss out these benefits. Join the society today. You can do so in systemdynamics.org/membership. And I just want to give a shout out to our all society sponsors. It's only through their help that we are able to continue doing this great work of expanding the system dynamics field. And if you'd like to sponsor the society, you can email me at office@systemdynamics.org, and I'd love to start a conversation with you there. Just a small agenda for today. We're having about 15 minutes of presentation. We're starting with David Straw, going with Kaveh Dianati and Martin Eskenazi. And we're going to have a 15 minutes Q&A by the end of the presentation. And again, you're using Poll Everywhere. If you're not familiar to Poll Everywhere, there's going to be a link here on the chat. Monique is helping me out. So you can send your questions throughout the conversation and throughout the presentation. You can also go to scan this QR code on your screen or go to pollev.com and enter the code STS-POLS877. So to get started, I have just a small question for you. So you guys can head to Poll Everywhere. I just would like to know, how do you say hello in your mother tongue? You can share. In Portuguese, we say olá. Enable, yeah. So how do you say in yours? Let me see some responses here. Hello, konnichiwa, hola, ciao, for some people from Italy, then for some people from Brazil and Portugal, the States, of course, bonjour, with friends. We usually cover a lot of time zones, and I love the diversity of our community. You know, we throughout the whole world, people joining us. So yeah, I see you guys get the idea. You'll be able to upvote and downvote your questions, the favorite questions. So please do so throughout the presentations. And yeah, so I can see you guys are good with Poll Everywhere. Just moving ahead. I always have some trouble with changing this slide. So briefly introduce to you guys David Straw. You guys may know him. He's the author of the Systems Thinking for Social Change. He's also from the Bridge the Way Partners. And Martin Eskenazi, he's from the Housing Department of the Dutch Ministry of the Interior. And Kaveh Dianati, he just graduated with a PhD at University College London. And I'm really excited to have them all here. We're starting with David. So David, that's all from me. If you wanna share a screen and start. Oh, oops, just stop my screen.
Okay, here it is. Great. Good. Well, thank you all for coming. I titled this Factors Impacting Affordable Housing because my work in housing has been mostly indirect rather than direct. It's been around other issues, poverty, wealth inequality, economic development, and homelessness have been some of the cases I've been involved in. And that's what I'll be talking about today, and how housing interacts with those different factors. Just to give you a summary of what I'll be covering, one of the challenges that I've addressed has been increasing upward mobility or reducing poverty in cities like Charlotte, North Carolina, and Mobile, Alabama, both in the South of the United States. And some of the findings are the connection between affordable housing and poverty and racism. Those are connected. Poverty itself is a function of wealth inequality and growing wealth inequality, certainly in the US and other countries. And not all paths to economic development reduce poverty. So those are some of the things that we'll be looking at together. And then I did a project with a colleague of mine who's a society member, Michael Goodman, long-term colleague, on ending homelessness in Calhoun County, Michigan. And some of the insights here are how we help people cope with homelessness undermines our ability to end homelessness. And the gains from Housing First, which is the policy in the United States about creating more permanent, safe, affordable housing for homeless people, is limited by constraints on affordable housing. And then finally, a cautionary tale from Sioux Falls, South Dakota, the housing authority there. You'll be seeing diagrams, as Fernando said, that are qualitative in nature, that are causal loop diagrams based on system archetypes rather than system dynamics models. And obviously the issue is more complex than what I will be portraying, and it'll be interesting to see what Martine and Kaveh have to say as well, so we can start adding up the different pieces. I work a lot with system archetypes for several reasons. One, because they make systems thinking accessible. They describe very recognizable human stories that are readily transferable to many different situations. And I think of systems thinking as the ability to help people see the stories that they tell themselves and to create stories that are more valuable for them, more effective. They incorporate known systems traps, mental models, and leverage points, so they're easy to address from those perspectives. They serve as catalysts to understand and communicate greater complexity. So I think of them as the seeds of more complex insights and analyses. And finally, and very importantly, they help people shift the focus from either feeling ashamed about what they're not doing well or blaming others for what they think they are not doing well to a stance of acceptance and responsibility for the issues as they experience them. So within Charlotte and Mobile and other places that I've worked, one of the things that I pay attention to is intergenerational poverty as a vicious cycle, and at least one of the reinforcing mental models that creates that vicious cycle. So here we're concerned today about the ability to pay for quality housing in a safe environment. That's what is a goal of our work around understanding housing. And that is, of course, impacted in part by earning power, people having living wage jobs. And where do those living wage jobs and earning power come from? They come, at least in part, from education and how well people do in education. And of course, there's a time delay here for that earning power to show up. And where does education performance come from? Well, it comes, at least in part, from the strength of the family unit, the ability to provide stability, parenting, education support at home. And where does that come from? At least it comes in part from the ability to pay for quality housing in a safe environment. And at least where I do a lot of my work in the US, this is a vicious cycle for many people. Low ability to pay for quality housing reduces the strength of the family, the ability to get a good education, earning power into the next generation around where they are able to live. And one of the mental models that can show up here is, what's the use of trying? We're in this vicious cycle. What's the use of trying? Particularly in the US, but maybe in more and more in other developed countries, there is the issue of racism and structural racism in particular that aggravates all of these different factors. Issues such as police brutality, mass incarceration, segregation, voting restrictions, limited financial and social capital. So all of those make housing a real challenge for people, and those challenges tend to get addressed individually. Some people focused on housing, some agencies focused on housing, others on family, others on education, etc. And very rarely do we see a comprehensive approach that recognizes and seeks to address the interdependencies between all of them. Whoops. Oh. And with structural racism, there's a compounding mental model, which is it's their fault. If you're poor, it's because it's your fault. Now, that vicious cycle is also connected to a virtuous cycle. So another systems archetype is success to the successful. The rich get richer and the poor get poorer. So just as we see a vicious cycle affecting people who are poorer, that also is connected to a virtuous cycle for the elite. As they get more resources, they create more opportunities, have more success, and hence are able to get more resources the next time round. So what we're seeing, and the US again is a very dramatic example of this, the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer, which means the vicious cycle that you just saw in the previous slides is getting more and more intense. And one of the things that compounds that vicious cycle is this one, what I call ethnic manipulation. It's the fanning of tensions between different people in lower economic classes as a way of diverting attention to the from the class issues to the ethnic differences that are involved. And a certain group of the elite are very good, and this is true all over the world, of taking the attention off of the unfairness of the class divide by fanning tensions between ethnic groups who are, let's say, poor whites and poor blacks, which intensifies structural racism, which further reduces opportunities for at least a subset of the poor. Now, one would assume that economic development would be an important part of the solution to housing. But what I've seen in my work in Charlotte and Mobile again and other areas, different paths to economic development are not equal. And this is a shifting the burden structure. Charlotte is a particularly dramatic example, which grew enormously in the last 10 to 20 years because of the banking industry. And the consolidation of banks in the Charlotte area. What they did then in response and reaction to the pressure to increase living wage jobs was to import white collar jobs and talent. And a more fundamental solution that I'm working on with several cities is to invest in local talent and the development of minority and women-owned businesses, local minority and women-owned businesses. Now, notice the time delays. This is harder to do. It takes longer to generate those living wage jobs. And what happens in the meantime is the importing of that white collar talent increases housing prices, increases gentrification, increases the cost of living, and actually then increases the pressure to increase living wage jobs even further. And gentrification also further disrupts communities in which poorer people live, which makes it even harder to invest in local talent and the development of those local businesses. So we see a number of vicious cycles, a fix that backfires here, part of it shifting the burden down here. And those imported white collar jobs also divert public resources to new residents, and that includes housing and transport and education, which makes it, again, even harder to cultivate the kind of local talent that would be a more sustainable way of reducing this pressure to increase living wage jobs. About 15 years ago, I got involved with Mike Goodman in a project to end homelessness in Calhoun County, Michigan, which is a county of about 100,000 people, surrounding Battle Creek, Michigan, where the Kellogg Foundation is located. And what we discovered is that the common way of addressing homelessness to help people cope with homelessness is through temporary shelters and supports. A more fundamental way of dealing with that is through permanent affordable housing, critical services for those mentally ill who need it, and employment for those who don't. So this is the quick fix and a more fundamental solution of what in the US at least is known as housing first. What the community discovered is that however well-intentioned those temporary shelters were, they had several unintended consequences. One was they reduced the visibility of the problem of homelessness, which then reduced pressure in the community to make the more fundamental shifts that would be required to create a more fundamental solution. In addition, funding those temporary shelters and supports led to money for the existing, usually nonprofit organizations that were involved. And because of that funding, their willingness and the time that they had and the funding that was available to innovate and collaborate in service of the more fundamental solution were all very, very low. And compounding this was the donor pressure for short-term results. We can look, as Board of Trustees, we can feel proud, for example, that we're helping fill all of these shelter beds. So what we in fact had here were a number of vicious cycles that actually undermined the more fundamental solution of permanent housing. And there were a bunch of mental models, and we use, again, mental models in our work to literally bring these analyses to life. Public officials were saying, well, look, why bother? It might be best practice housing first, but it's too hard, takes too long, and is too expensive. How often have we heard that as a set of reasons for not investing there? The service providers were saying, look, we have to help people now. It's the humane thing to do. That's why we provide these temporary shelters. The public was saying, what's the problem? And we have more pressing needs. They weren't seeing the severity of the problem. The service providers, again, were saying we have to protect our own funding. So many of you may be familiar with sort of a nonprofit industry in whatever field you're interested in, where people have an investment, financial investment, in actually continuing to do things the way they're being done. And then, of course, you have the donors who are saying, well, our board expects results, and those are usually short-term results. So one would assume, again, very hard to get here, but affordable housing, permanent affordable housing would be the right way to go. And in fact, there's a dividend to housing first. There are dividends in terms of reduced social and economic costs of homelessness, which would increase the incentives for housing first, or at least they should, which should lead to more permanent, affordable, and supportive housing, and hence reap more of the dividends for reduced social and economic costs of homelessness. This ideally would be an engine of growth for more affordable housing. However, there are serious limits to this. The available land is often undermined, is constrained by competitive land use pressures for, let's say, industry, other commercial uses, and very seriously, the NIMBY effect, or not in my backyard, where residents are happy to have more dense, affordable housing, but not where I live. And those have led over the years, again, primarily looking at the US, at regulatory constraints on land use, environmental, single-family zoning, which further constrains available land and hence the ability to create this affordable housing. The costliness of the available land increases new construction costs, which further then reduces the incentives for housing first. And finally, you have, when you build this housing, assuming you are able to build housing for the homeless, you get an in-migration of more homeless people from other areas that then further reduces the amount of that available housing. So some sample outcomes from these cases. In Charlotte, we streamlined nearly 100 recommendations for increasing upward mobility into a coherent systemic theory of change and a very limited number of short-term initiatives. They were trying to juggle many, many different factors here, again, of which housing was one. In Mobile, CEOs who are in that region, backed by their Chamber of Commerce, have committed now to increasing purchasing from local minority-owned businesses, despite the fact that in the short term, that may not be the most efficient solution for them. And in Calhoun County, and this occurred during the period of the major recession in 2008, 2009, homelessness decreased by 14% despite a significant increase in unemployment and in evictions. Let me step back a little bit because this is a qualitative analysis, not a quantitative one. None of them are. but I want to emphasize some of the benefits of qualitative systems thinking approaches. Oh, the cautionary tale before I do that. This is what I presented to Sioux Falls, South Dakota, to their housing authority one day without, and this is a warning, without sufficient building of a foundation for change in that community. They had asked to gain some insight into why they were having trouble increasing their supply of permanent, safe, supportive, and accessible, financially affordable and viable housing. And I had lots of different reasons here. There are about 10 feedback loops. I was there for a day. We kicked the tires on this model and I never saw them again. And hence the cautionary tale about showing too much complexity too quickly. So some summary observations I would like to offer. One, I really appreciate Albert Einstein's quote, everything should be made as simple as possible, but not simpler. And I find there is enormous power in simplicity in the work that I do. This from Stuart Emery, who is the founder of a personal growth organization called Actualizations, said, life is simple, it's just not always easy. And as a corollary, I think when life gets hard, we tend to make it complex as a way of avoiding the fact that it's hard. Do we want to help people cope with homelessness, for example, or do we actually want to end it and do what it would take to end it, not just help people cope with it? And to me, the process is as important as the insights that we generate from our models. So with that, thank you very much. I welcome any questions now, or we'll turn it over to Kaveh to continue.
Thank you, David. Yeah, we're moving on to Kaveh now. He's talking about London's housing crisis. Kaveh, are you there? Let me just spotlight. Yeah.
Thanks, Fernando. Just trying to share my screen. Can you see my slide?
Yeah, we can see it perfectly.
Okay, great. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are. Thank you all for joining this session. My name is Kaveh Diyanati. I've recently submitted my PhD at UCL, University College London. And right now I'm joining this session from Oslo in Norway, where I've started my new job at DNV. This presentation is on the results of my PhD on the topic of London's housing crisis, where I've used system dynamics to look at long-term developments in London's housing market in the past, but also in the future under various scenarios. So this work focuses more on the economic and financial aspects of housing rather than the societal aspects, which was the focus of David's presentation. So I have quite a few slides. Let's get right into it. I'm going to try and go through them as efficiently as I can so as to leave enough time for discussion at the end. So I'll start with a brief introduction and background into the problem. Then I will present a summary of my reading of the literature on the housing crisis. I will show an overview of the SD model. I'll continue with showing some validation results before moving on to perhaps the most interesting part of the work, which is the policy analysis. And I will close with a brief conclusion. So London's housing crisis has many different aspects when people refer to the housing crisis, they mean different things. So here at the outset, I'm just going to outline those aspects which have been the focus of this PhD. First and foremost, there's the affordability aspect, which is shown here in this graph of the ratio of house prices to earnings. This is the most common measure of affordability, which, as you can see, has almost tripled over the past couple of decades or so in London, which means that affordability has fallen by a factor of 3. And this rate of decline in affordability has been much faster in London than in England as a whole. Then there is the aspect of volatility and cyclicality, shown here by this graph of detrended and normalized fluctuations in 3 of the key variables in the system: in house prices, in new mortgage lending, and in new house building. And as you can see, there's a clear cyclical pattern as well as a high degree of co-movement. And this level of instability is obviously not good for the economy as a whole. And finally, there is the aspect of developments in tenure. And here I would like to draw your attention to the decline in owner occupation tenure, which started around the beginning of the century in London. And along with that, the rapid rise in the privately rented sector, which, as a matter of fact, is also the most expensive and the most insecure form of tenure. So against this backdrop, I've defined my 2 main research questions as follows. First, what are the key underlying mechanisms responsible for the excessive growth and periodic oscillations in house prices, housing finance, and residential construction in London since 1980? And given this underlying structure, what are the implications of the structure for the future of London's housing market, both under business as usual and under alternative policies? If you look at the literature on the UK's or London's housing crisis, or if you listen to media coverage of the topic, by far the most common and prevalent narrative that you're going to read about is a narrative of shortage in supply, to the extent that for many people, the housing crisis is synonymous with a crisis of supply shortage. And this narrative is usually accompanied with a graph that looks something like this, which shows new house building in the UK since the 1950s. And as you can see, there has been a sharp decline in new house building since the late 1960s, which is mainly the result of a slowdown and eventually complete cessation of local authorities house building or council house building. And if you look at the situation in London, where data is available only since 1980, the picture is broadly similar. In London, we have seen some slow rise in private residential construction, but the rate of this rise has been nowhere near proportional to the rise in house prices. And also, if you look at the average annual growth rates in population, in the number of jobs, and in the number of homes, you will see that both population and the number of jobs have grown much faster in London than in England as a whole, but the number of homes has grown at exactly the same rate. So perhaps there's no surprise that the Greater London Authority has reported a rising backlog of housing need in London of probably around 500,000 units by now. But this narrative of supply shortage is not the only show in town. The critics of this narrative cite different figures. For instance, if you look at the figures of London's total housing stock and the number of households, you will see that since 1991, they have both grown equally by about 19%. And also, Greater London Authority has consistently reported a surplus of housing units over households over the past decades. So what exactly is going on here? Well, this competing narrative argues that rather than a crisis of absolute shortage in supply, we are facing a crisis of inequality in the distribution of housing. So in other words, in Britain, we have enough land and housing. It is just that it is increasingly owned by smaller and smaller elites. And this is evidenced by the growing number of second homes and buy-to-hold properties that restricts effective supply, which brings us to the issue of speculative investment demand. During the past couple of decades, London's total private housing stock has grown by about 500,000 units. But during the same time, the stock of owner-occupied dwellings has actually fallen by about 50,000 units, while at the same time, the stock of privately rented dwellings has grown by about the sum of the two figures, which means that on aggregate, the privately rented sector has not only absorbed all new growth in the housing stock, but it's also bitten a substantial chunk of the owner-occupied dwelling stock. And the concern here is that those with existing housing wealth can continue to crowd out first-time buyers, especially considering that they can leverage their existing housing property as collateral to raise more funds and increase their housing wealth even further. And this brings us to the important issue of the growing stock of mortgage debt, which has to do with the deregulation of the financial markets, which started in the 1980s in the UK under Margaret Thatcher's administration, while in the US, similar developments were happening under Reagan's administration. And this led to a flood of credit into the housing market. The stock of outstanding mortgage debts as a percentage of GDP stood at about 22% in 1980. And by 2009, just after the global financial crisis, it had reached a mind-blowing 81%, and it stands at around 67% right now. Also, if you look at household debt as share of household disposable income, you will see that UK households are quite a bit more indebted and more under the burden of housing debt than the average of advanced economies, the G7 average. And this level of indebtedness is clearly dangerous from a macroeconomic perspective. It has been a driver of house price inflation and its instability in the housing finance nexus. A related development is that, again, since the 1980s, banks have switched their business model from lending to businesses and economic firms, which constituted the lion's share of their lending. Over time, they've switched more and more to mortgage lending, which has now replaced business lending as the key source of business for commercial banks. And this again is perverse from a macroeconomic perspective, because it is lending to businesses that supports growth in the economy, in employment, in wages, and so on, while lending against existing housing property does little else than lead to house price inflation and provide more wealth to those who already have it. With regards to housing in system dynamics, there's a long tradition of housing work in ST, which goes back to obviously Forrester's urban dynamics. Much more recently, there is Martin Esquinas's thesis towards housing system dynamics, which offers a comprehensive review of the literature on housing, and I'm sure Martin is going to speak more about this afterwards. There have been various other works in the context of countries such as Turkey, Iran, China, South Korea, and the US. With some exceptions, all this work in the area of housing has been largely based on theoretical and experimental models, and it's been done in isolation from the field of housing economics and with little empirical grounding. So in this work, my aspiration has been to, rather than operating in isolation of social sciences, I've tried to follow advice from Martin Eskenazi and Nelson Repenning, who advise SD practitioners to collaborate with academics of the field and to ground their work in the literature of the field that they are trying to enter. So I started with translating and organizing my reading of the literature in a qualitative causal loop diagram. Then I converted what I consider to be the most important parts of the causal loop diagram into a quantitative SD model with 4 sectors: the house prices sector, the mortgage sector, construction sector, and the tenure and rent sector. Here I'm going to walk you through a much simplified causal loop diagram of the quantitative model. So here I've tried to highlight some of the most important feedback loops, starting in the center with the key house prices variable. This first loop shows the investment loop, where as house prices rise, this creates more incentive for investing, speculative investing in housing assets, creating the first reinforcing structure. Then as house prices rise, this is going to price out more and more households from the buying market into the privately rented sector, which creates more demand in this sector, raises private rents, and raises the attractiveness of investment in housing assets. And then once again, as house prices rise, this creates more demand for new mortgage loans, both directly and via an increase in housing wealth. And more and more mortgage loans being issued, this creates additional demand for housing, creating another reinforcing structure here. So these 3 reinforcing loops are what I believe what has been the underlying structure behind the exponential growth in house prices and housing finance. But as you know, nothing can grow forever. After a while, balancing mechanisms are bound to kick in. So for instance, as more and more mortgage loans are being issued, over time, this accumulates in a stock of housing debt, which raises the debt service ratio, which is basically the share of household income required to service housing debts. And after a while, there is ample evidence that debt service ratios beyond a certain level would restrict consumption, investment, savings, and all key economic variables. And this can backfire, and over time, after perhaps several years, feedback to restrict new mortgage lending. And at a certain point, when these balancing feedback loops become dominant, powerful enough to become dominant in the system, it can trigger all of these reinforcing loops as well in the opposite direction and lead to the bust period of the recurring boom and bust cycles that we have witnessed over the past decades in the housing and finance systems. So if we simulate the model against and compare it against historical data shown here in black, simulation shown in gray, for the key house prices variable, for example, we can see that the model manages to capture the exponential growth as well as the characteristic fluctuations in house prices. I've also provided the goodness of field statistics in the thesis, and this shows that most of the error is concentrated in unequal covariance, which is what we would like to see with a high degree of correlation. The same is true for other key variables in the model for new mortgage lending, for example, for the stock of mortgage balances outstanding. Here, note the exponential rise in the stock of mortgage debt, especially during the noughties. The same for new house building and the total dwelling stock by type of tenure. So what does the model tell us about the future if we extend the simulation? Well, two things. Under business as usual, the model predicts that we will continue to see exponential rise in house prices and in new mortgage loan in most key variables in the system, as well as long-term and large amplitude oscillations in the system, as we have seen before. And in terms of developments in tenure, we will continue to see a slowly declining trend in owner occupation and slowly rising privately rented sector. And these are obviously not outcomes that we would like to see in the future. So I've simulated a number of scenarios, both on the supply side and on the demand side. On the supply side, I have three scenarios. The first reflects the Greater London Authority's Affordable Homes Programme, which aims to build a highly ambitious, perhaps unrealistically ambitious number of new affordable units per year. So this is the Affordable Homes Programme. The second one reflects a relaxation of planning restrictions in an effort to incentivize and stimulate private house building. And the third scenario, the integrated supply side one, combines the two assumptions. So in other words, we are intervening here, trying to balance house prices by stimulating private construction, and also by direct intervention through government, local authority and housing association, affordable house building. So looking at the results, as expected, these interventions will increase the rate of housing supply, and the integrated one, the combined one, the dotted curve here, leads to the fastest growth in total housing stock and the lowest house prices and house price to income ratios, so the biggest improvement in affordabilities. So the integrated one is the most promising in expanding supply and slowing down the growth in house prices. But as we saw, again, these scenarios do nothing to dampen the large scale oscillations in the system. And also the affordability will continue to decline, although much more slowly than business as usual. So moving on to the demand side scenarios. On the demand side, I have four scenarios. The first one is a capital gains tax policy, which extends the capital gains tax, where we extend the capital gains tax to primary residences, which are at the moment exempt from this tax. The second one is the loan to value ratio. Second and third one are what is called macroprudential policies. So sort of contractionary policies on the financial side. So the first one tries to limit loan to value ratios and decrease average loan to value ratios. The third one needs perhaps a bit of explanation. In the UK, when banks issue mortgage loans, they take the current market value of the house as a basis for issuing the loan. But this is not the case everywhere. In countries such as Germany, with much more stable housing finance systems, banks are required to anchor the amount of the loans in the past prices of housing. So here in this scenario, I've used a 5-year moving average of house prices for the valuation of houses for mortgage lending. And this is considered to be a stabilizing policy. And finally, in the integrated demand side scenario, I combine all three demand side interventions. So in other words, back to the causal loop diagram here, I have the important investment loop and I have the housing finance loop on the right-hand side. So the capital gains tax is trying to weaken the investment loop via disincentivizing investment in housing assets, and the other policies, the two other policies, lower LTVs and historically anchored valuation, is trying to weaken the housing finance loops. All right, so let's just look at this dashed curve here, which is the integrated demand side scenario. As you can see, this scenario promises to almost flatten out the large amplitude oscillations in the system, in house prices, for example. And the same for new mortgage lending. It becomes stable, and it also stops growing exponentially as in the past. So we have lower level of mortgage lending, and also the number of new mortgage advances is going to become much more stable. But interestingly, and perhaps counterintuitively, if you look at the average number of new mortgage advances over the entire period, you will see that in the integrated, well, under demand side scenarios, and especially in the integrated demand side scenario, the number of new mortgage advances is actually higher rather than lower of business unusual. And this is contrary to what you would expect, because normally contractionary financial policies are set to restrict access to home ownership. And the model shows that this is probably not necessarily the case. Actually, we might have a smaller total pie of mortgage lending in terms of value on the left-hand side, but each slice of that pie has shrunk by so much that it can now be divided over a much larger number, or a substantially larger number of households, both because of lower house prices and because of lower loan-to-value ratios and higher degree of stability over the long term in general. So this is an important counterintuitive insight of this modeling work. So in other words, demand side scenarios serve to slow down the growth in house prices and credit and almost eliminate the oscillations. And contrary to what you would expect, they can actually serve to potentially widen rather than restrict access to more buyers. And also considering the other capital gains tax policy, these buyers are more likely to be first-time buyers rather than speculative buyers. So this is also potentially a good thing. But at the same time, even in the demand side, under the demand side scenarios, affordability continues to decline, albeit much more slowly. And there is the caveat that private residential construction could potentially be hurt by the tighter financial regime. So this brings us to the final comprehensive scenario, which combines all 5 interventions on both supply and demand sides, shown here by the long dashed curves. And this, only in this scenario, we managed to, first of all, make the system much more stable, and also bring down house price to income ratios, or improve affordability back to levels where we saw sort of at the beginning of the century here. And again, much lower level of household indebtedness on aggregate, but giving the highest number of mortgage advances than the other scenarios. So in summary, the business as usual scenario showed that under current conditions, we are likely to continue to see worsening affordability and boom and bust cycles in the system. The supply side scenarios, they were successful in slowing down the worsening of affordability, but they could not dampen the oscillations, because the oscillations had nothing to do with supply side dynamics. Demand side policies did curb both house price inflation and volatility, but affordability still continued to deteriorate there as well. And it was only the ambitious, comprehensive portfolio of policies that managed to improve both affordability and dampen the oscillations. And in this scenario, average housing cost is also expected to go down as a result of lower private rents, more affordable homes, and lower mortgage repayments. And counterintuitively, average number of new mortgage advances in this scenario exceeds all other scenarios, while the debt burden stays the lowest. So in conclusion, and specifically from a methodological perspective, which is the interest of this a group of people, due to the numerous limitations in the model, as with any other model that I've listed in the thesis, rather than claiming to have built the definitive model of London's housing, I'd like to present this more as a hopefully successful proof of concept and a strong case in support of the usefulness of system dynamics or similar dynamic simulation models for complex problems of housing crisis in London, but also in other metropolises facing the same sort of issues. And if I want to leave you with just a couple of takeaway messages from this presentation, I argue that the unit of analysis in housing policy and discourse must become feedback loops rather than individual factors, which is currently the case. If you ask people, why are we facing the housing crisis, they would offer simplistic explanations such as, oh, we are not building homes fast enough, or it is because of a broken planning system. So linear explanations. But I think that we could make such explanations a bit more sophisticated, and terminology such as the investment loop, the housing finance loop, and the debt burden loop, I think must enter the political and scientific discourse around housing. So thank you very much for your attention. So if I took a bit long, I look forward to your questions and comments at the end.
Thank you so much, Kaveh. Now we're moving on to Martin. You were muted, Martin.
I'm muted. So this is better?
Yeah,
okay.
We can hear you.
Share your screen. Let me share the screen. Here we are. And switch on to presentation mode. Well, thank you all for inviting me to join the Housing Dynamics System webinar. My name is Martijn Eskenazi. I worked as a consultant, a researcher, and currently a policymaker in most of my professional career in housing in the Netherlands. The Netherlands is, let's say, a country with a very specific, let's say, housing context. So I'm a housing guy, but I'm also a system dynamics practitioner. And a couple of years ago, I wrote my PhD on called Towards Housing System Dynamics, which is basically a report of my struggle with mastering system dynamics and applying this in a setting with policymakers, with other researchers from social scientists. And today I'm not going to go deep into one or two of the models, but try to provide you some, let's say, overall transfer of experiences in which I had during working with system dynamics. So basically the PhD from 2013 is focused on, let's say, systematizing the connection between system dynamics and housing research, housing policy research, whatever you want to call it. One part which I found interesting is that there's, at that time, there was about 150 or so, let's say, single publications on system dynamics and housing. Of course, you all heard of course, you all know urban dynamics and stuff like that, and the follow-up to that. But then there's a large trend of, let's say, system dynamics housing, conference paper, books, etc., contributions. And the issue with that is that it's more or less, as we call in Dutch, it's loose end. Lots of these conference papers and stuff, they don't really connect to one another. Some, of course, refer to urban dynamics, but it's possible that in the same decade you'll find 2 papers of different authors in the same city, which are referring to urban dynamics, but not to one another. So that was relatively striking. And I had the luck to do some case studies of about five projects with, let's say, modeling, which I had my learning experiences, but also try to disseminate or to dissect the models into, let's say, some modeling molecules. Let's say try to find basic structures which can be reused. And I would like to share some thoughts about how to embed system dynamics in, let's say, common policy research. So let's first take a look. Why should housing be included in, let's say, the system dynamics agenda? It's increasingly a big issue. After the first 2 speakers, I don't think I have to elaborate more on that. It relates to many important challenges in society: traffic inequality, house energy efficiency, sustainability, much more. There's a good starting point or a good entry point that it's a field of interest in which stock and flow thinking and decision-making loops are very self-evident. People always talk about the housing stock, etc. There's lots of flows, construction, demolition, etc. So there's an inroad over there. Of course, we see some wicked dynamics, which is also always nice for system dynamics modeling in order to find the structure which is causing these dynamics. And it's in many cases multi-actor problems, and their problems are messy. And if you take a good look at the field of interest you're working in, you'll be able to find some, let's say, interesting reference modes of behaviors, which might not be explainable from, let's say, common economic theories. If prices rise, why would supply go down? Of course, that's economic thinking, but the challenge for system dynamics is to explain the mechanisms underlying such counterintuitive developments. To elaborate a bit on the multi-actor aspect, it's households, it's companies, it's governments, it's NGOs, it's banks, it's non-profit housing associations, it's homeless shelters, it's many actors involved. Supply chains of actors, which is also a field of study in system dynamics. And let's not forget it, there are diametrically opposed political and scientific perspectives on housing, on the housing market. For instance, you can have, let's say, right-wing, let's say neoliberal, you can have more social democrats or any kind of political views. And of course, there's also, let's say, different scientific perspectives, let's say real estate economics, and there's more, let's say, housing-oriented social science, social geography perspectives on housing. And the interesting thing is you'll encounter all of them if you're in the field of housing for some time. And how will you make these perspectives meet? And how will this affect your system dynamics works? So basically, as I told you, I had the privilege of doing about five system dynamics projects over 1 or 1.5 decades, which some of them were successful to a certain extent, and some of them were only successful because they provided lots of learning because they were so unsuccessful. Best learning is in many cases in the big failures. My first model which I encountered should have deterred me forever of system dynamics, but it didn't manage to do so. There was once, let's say, a model called ITS, Integrated Strategic Thinking Model or something, which was related to, let's say, policy changes in the early 1990s, focused on the role of housing associations. Before this time, these housing associations were really embedded, let's say, in states policy making, in state loops. And in the 1990s, it was decided to sever the ties, the over-complex ties with the government, with subsidies, loans, and all this stuff. So they were not really privatized, but they were made more or less independent, and they had to think of their strategy. So initially, this modeling helped to gain certain strategic insights. It's in the book about group model building by Jacques Wennix. But in the end, when it was transferred to a consultancy company, it got entangled in, let's say, a complexity loop. It was used for, let's say, not for strategic thinking, but for operational forecasting. Of course, then there's lots of details with which are not right, which were filled in by the modeler. The model got more complex, more issues arose. Data obesity and failure dynamics killed this model. So it was very interesting how this model ended. And it also provides, of course, learning on how to deal with this, because the issue is that one of the issues is that it got entangled in, let's say, these different perspectives. The system dynamics perspective, which was counteracted by the, let's say, the accountant and bookkeeping perspective. The accountants want to have more details and their particular view in it. And the modeler just tried to do it all, but he worked himself into burnout dynamics, and this is when the model collapsed. Interesting learning. Haaglanden was another model in the, let's say, the region of The Hague. There was a conflict between housing associations and municipalities on how things worked. If they want to do first, let's say, urban revitalization, or I should focus on, let's say, greenfield development of new houses. So somehow I managed to make a relatively small and simple model, which provided some policy runs. And in the process of, let's say, working on this model and talking about the different perspectives on what should be first, what should be priorities, the parties gained, let's say, more understanding of each other's perspective on the matter. And especially the policy runs also helped them show that there were different sides of the coins. So in a sense, this Haaglanden model, which is, let's say, it's not a very complex model, it's mostly stocks and it's driven by external time series, which is not good system dynamics at all. But in the end, it filled its purpose because we had policy results, it's improved understanding. Then I was more involved in, let's say, research, and I started working on a model called Houdini, which is, let's say, based in real estate economics. And I started to introduce, let's say, institutional economic thinking. Why are these institutions? Which also may modeled in the causal loops. You can model the institutions by means of causal loop modeling and stocks and flows. And they might help you understand the dynamics of your problem. I'll show a bit more of that later. The Houdini model developed into, let's say, the Middle Incomes Project, which provided an impact analysis of, let's say, it's very specific for the Dutch context, but there was one reform proposed which was highly debated. And the middle income model was, let's say, the only feasible way of, let's say, showing the possible effects of different policy options. But it was interesting that we found that, people would expect, let's say, reinforcing aspects, but more or less it was a trade-off. And the reform aspect was futile in the long run anyway, which was an interesting finding as well. This project was very much a mixed method project, and it got even to, let's say, reports into Parliament and was used for decision making as well. These mixed methods were important, and I'll come to that later a little bit. And of course, another small model was focused on, let's say, the mortgage dynamics in the Netherlands, comparable to what KV has been showing. We showed that the proposed reforms did not include high leverage policies. There were no feasible options to, let's say, to deeply influence the dynamics surrounding the mortgages. There were striking effects and differences between generations. And the interesting stuff is that it was built in really close cooperation with, let's say, very classically schooled real estate economists, which tend to be, let's say, the antagonist of system dynamics, closed loop thinking towards econometric, logic thinking, as it used to be called in the old days. But somehow people got convinced of the added value of these models because, I'll get to it later in a sec. So basically, if I'm taking in hindsight what happened during my modeling experiences, what contributed to the modeling side, it's basically if you know the subject well. Of course, I've been in housing for my entire career, so you get a sense of what's going on over there. I guess that in any field of interest, in any scientific discipline, you will find implicit system dynamics models. And if you want to connect to the perspective of these other social scientists, a good entry point is to find, for instance, an economic model from an real estate economics textbooks, which can be easily translated into system dynamics. This real estate model has got an implicit system dynamic structures. There's all kinds of balancing mechanisms going on. There's stocks, there's flows, as you can see. And the easy entry point is just to try to redraw the thing in stocks, flows, etc. Then you have a connecting point speaking the same language as these practitioners. And of course, the interesting thing starts. This is a very simple balancing loop with external, with some material delays, with some external drivers based on, let's say, growth factors. But the interesting thing, if you start looking for, let's say, strange reference modes of behaviors, different dynamics than expected from, let's say, basic equilibrium thinking, it's interesting to start adding institutional aspects. For instance, if we have this template model, this very basic template model, how would you model, for instance, rent controls? Or the dynamics of mortgages, KV-debt, or land use planning, or residual land pricing, which is, or the effect of demographic development and the aging of population, the idea of investor behavior. When you think of all these bits and parts which can be found in, let's say, the housing literature, of the real estate economic literature, you'll get some ideas how to add these to your template models. And then basically you can depart from, let's say, a relatively simple stock and flow model and try to add, let's say, other modeling molecules. And of course, the basic question which you have to focus on if you observe some kind of behavior, you want to find the structure which is responsible for, let's say, in the previous example, the idea that prices can go up and construction or supply can go down. There must be some kind of explanatory structure which says, well, this structure can generate such kind of behavior. This is what helps you understand the dynamics of the housing market in close connection with the social scientists and the economists working over there. So in my PhD, you'll find lots and lots of modeling molecules. I try to be a bit systematic in that, just, let's say, describe in simple possible terms some structures which might be useful. Of course, the impact of, let's say, vacant houses and pricing, financial accelerators, the stuff of Kave's excellent PhD study. There's complexity in production chains. There's the aspect of social housing and waiting lists, and demographic dynamics. And of course, I can add many more, let's say, of these components from these models, which help to explain in relatively simple terms the dynamics going on. They're mostly based in, let's say, the common knowledge in these disciplines, and they help in connecting to the mental maps of social scientists, of housing researchers, geographers, and economists. So basically the question which was also already posed by Nelson Repenning, we've addressed that paper, was already addressed in the discussion and in Kave's presentation. Still one of the issues is, why is system dynamics in relative isolation? Why doesn't it get taken up by mainstream policy research, etc.? Why is it a niche? Of course, there's the historical factor that Professor Forrester got entangled in some difficult debates in the early years. But on the other hand, Nelson Repennings put there's of course lots of criticisms on urban dynamics, saying that he doesn't use the existing knowledge which is there. He doesn't use the data. He just talks to policy officials and goes modeling over there. But Nelson Repenning writes, and I would really recommend you to read this paper, gave an excellent account of why these models didn't land, because they did not connect to, let's say, the regular mental models already existing in these fields of interest. And this led me to the idea that how will you get acceptance of SD modeling in policy research? It's more or less, it's similar, it's isomorphic to model validation. You of course know what, how we validate models. It's the gradual building of confidence, right? And of course, if we're working, let's say, on a specific model, you'll gradually build confidence by doing all the validation tests. System dynamics will take time and will need gradual building of confidence by working in fields with other methods. And of course, we also know the aphorism that all models are wrong, but some models are useful. I guess the same goes for methods. I mean, all methods are wrong, but some methods are useful, right? This would also apply. Maybe this sounds self-evident, but I think in some cases, system dynamics, people who are really, let's say, deeply into system dynamics are not very used to, let's say, working with these other disciplines. And there's some pitfalls. Let's say I've been working with housing planners and I'm working with housing economists. Two of the pitfalls which I encountered are, will be in this slide. First of all, there's, let's say, an ingrained notion in system dynamics that we have this far superior modeling methodology. We have the loops, we have the feedback, we have the better perspective, etc. Which might be true, but on the other hand, the other disciplines might think the same of their advanced methodologies. For instance, econometricians, how do you call them in proper English? They also think that they have very advanced modeling techniques. So this is basically, let's say, informal or subconscious attitude, which may be causing conflicts. The interesting thing about housing planners, they also make loops, lots of models, which are mostly forecast oriented. So their purpose is to make a prediction, try to make point predictions, and now progressing to the point where we say, well, it's got a certain, let's say, confidence interval. But they try to make these point predictions, and then their models tend to be open loop models and highly disaggregated models. So the housing stock in their models will consist of 6 sectors at least. There's a population which is dissected into 5 or 6 or 7 age groups, income groups, or whatever. And of course, they will need lots of data for it, and they find it hard to manage. So basically, they will be interested in methods which can help them manage this complexity. But once they get the hang of system dynamics, and if you're not very strong in, let's say, modeling, or if you're in a commercial environment, these people will start pooling on your models and try to put ever more detail in it. There's a risk of a detail explosion loop, and that's what happened with the first ITS model. So be careful about that. Don't get entangled into, let's say, making these forecast-oriented, focused, disintegrated models, even if the modeling software is perfectly fit for it. Still focus on explaining behavior in small models, explaining structures which explain behaviors, and try to focus at the policy level analysis. Housing economists are a different strand. They also have dynamic economic models. But the difference from system dynamics models is that they take theory as a starting point, and they're not focused on modeling problematic behavior. From their history before computational technique was advanced, they have, let's say, in their DNA is the thinking of equilibrium. What will happen when it is in equilibrium? They will focus on different equilibrium states, and they will focus mostly on, let's say, first order balancing models. They're not eager or not enticed to take into account higher order complexity, because in many cases it will not be possible to make analytical solutions, to just do the math on the model and find the equilibrium state. So we'll be shy on that. And of course, data is always an issue, because they want to calibrate, get the statistics right. It's very much focused on, let's say, matching these exact data rather than explaining the behavior. These are two issues which you may run in, let's say, they're, let's say, more or less colleagues, because they do modeling, they do housing modeling, but you need to really understand their modeling paradigms. And you need to know, choose your battles, how you're going to deal with them. I'm a proponent of, let's say, called embedded system dynamics. And of course, the great thing about system dynamics is that structure drives behavior, called isomorphism or isomorphy. The idea is that in different contexts, if you're working on housing or fishery or bacterial spread or anything, if you have the same structure, it will more or less behave the same, right? Same structure, same behavior. That comes from the basic theorem of system dynamics. But if you take a look at the career of many reputable system dynamicists, they tend to cover lots of ground as to disciplines. For instance, there's the book of Jacques Wennix, which covered housing, fishery fleet, and I guess healthcare or justice. Of course, he's a very reputable system dynamics practitioner, but it does not necessarily make a deep report with the issues deemed relevant by the researchers in, let's say, for instance, housing given. This one was a special case, but sometimes system dynamics people may lack, let's say, the deep report. And it's important because if all models are wrong, if all methods are wrong and some methods are useful, it's really appropriate to combine system dynamics in a research project with other methodologies. For instance, in the middle incomes project, as I told you, this was a relatively complex model, and no one had any clue about how to assess or the impact of this measure, which it was based on. But what we did, we made a model. We did interviews, we did standard data analysis and stuff and this. And during this project, everything started to add up. I mean, the findings from the model, we could check them, let's say, in the interviews with policymakers in the regions. We could use data analysis, standard data analysis, standard statistic analysis, and use it for the model. So basically what happens is that the story started up, the model says interesting things about this project. This is coherent with the stories we hear in the interviews. It's confirmed by other factors, by other methodologies, and then you have a strong story. And then also because, let's say, the model is coherent with, let's say, other methodological methods used in a project, this will help build confidence in system dynamics, right? The model helps us make the story more comprehensive. And of course, all methods are wrong, but some methods are useful. And the basic idea about embedded system dynamics is that you really have to find the deep niche in system dynamics in a field in which you are embedded. For me, that's easy to say because I did housing long before I did system dynamics. And it might be helpful to commit to one or only a few teams. And you really have to know the background in these research fields so well that you know which research issues are really suitable for using system dynamics. Of course, you can try to model everything with system dynamics, but there's lots of research issues which can be used by standard statistics, by surveys, by anything, right? If you're deeply embedded in this field, you know which research problems where you can make system dynamics excel. Get the point? System dynamics is good at, let's say, finding the structures, defining behavior. And it becomes stronger the moment you can make it, you know the field so well that you can make it exactly do that. You'll make system dynamics stronger by embedding it in research project with lots of other things going on. Literature review, statistic modeling, interviews, etc. Because this will help build confidence in system dynamics. But anyway, these are my experiences on stumbling and into the world of system dynamics, working with lots of people from different perspectives, and this is learning which I had to learn. I hope it's useful for you, and if not, and if so, thank you for listening to my presentation. Glad to be here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Martin. I've seen that some comments in the chat, but we also have a lot of questions in the poll everywhere. I'm gonna put this up. I know we're supposed to finish in 3 minutes. We're a little bit over time, but some people are probably very eager to get some answers for the questions. So we can maybe pick up these questions for about 15 minutes. Let me share my screen. Of course, there's questions for all the three presenters. Some of them starting with David. I'm gonna go ahead and pick just the most popular one here, which happens to be for David, who presented first. Do you want to read and reply to this question, David, maybe?
Sure. I will refer to my book, which is Systems Thinking for Social Change, because I have been particularly interested over the years in how do you integrate systems thinking into a model of change. I mean, ultimately, I think what we're trying to do is help people change their behavior in service of what they say they really want. Systems analysis, whether it be more qualitative or quantitative, is only one stage, in my experience, in a change model, which is going to significantly change behavior in a social system. So the reason also then for working with archetypes is that they do simplify complexity to the point where a stakeholder, most importantly, a diverse set of stakeholders, can align their insights, understand their own responsibility for contributing to the problem, albeit unwittingly, and therefore be more motivated to do something different, to reflect critically on their underlying intentions, their thinking, and their behavior.
Thank you, David. I'm just alerting you guys that we do have Systems Thinking for Social Change. That's David's book in our shop. I think Monique just put a link in the chat. You can find it there. So you're curious to know a little bit more about David's work. And I think this is also for you, David. How do you collect data for these projects, and how do you model assumptions about specific issues you can collect the data for?
Most of the data that I collect is through interviews with a diverse set of stakeholders. I normally work with, let's say there's a decision-making group and a modeling team. The modeling team is often made up of direct reports of those decision makers, and the structure is to work with the modeling team to come up with initial hypotheses based on interviews with the decision makers, and then feed those back initially to the modeling team, make adjustments, kick the tires, and then work with the decision-making group and go back and forth. This is an iterative process of first establishing shared understanding of why the frustrating behavior persists despite people's best efforts to change it, and then to develop insights about where the leverage is and ultimately create a systemic theory of change. So it's mostly based on interviews. It is supplemented by written documentation that the stakeholders provide.
Thank you, David. Let me find a few other questions here. There's one to Kaveh here. To what degree do you expect that your model findings would also apply to other cities with different parameters?
Short answer, to a quite high degree, I would say, especially other cities in other advanced liberal economies. To be honest, I can't think of any of the key feedback mechanisms in my model that are exclusive to London and London only. So especially in other cities where housing is seen as an important investment vehicle, and in contexts where housing has been highly financialized and there is a high financial presence in the city, like we have in London, in the city of London, I think you will find very similar, and there's actually evidence and books written on the similar dynamics that are driving the decline in affordability of housing across large cities in advanced economies.
Thank you, Kaveh. Oops, let me just hide this one. If I'm just scrolling down, if you guys want to answer any questions that you guys see here, please alert me. I can just stop. I think this might be for you as well, Kaveh. What would be the policy leverage points to keep the system in balance at a reasonable affordability level for housing, avoiding the exponential growth and boom and bust cycles?
Right. I suspect that this question might have been posed in the middle of my presentation, because actually in the second part, I focused on exactly that. Demand side macro prudential policies on the financial side that helped keep the system stable and at more reasonable levels of affordability, along supply side interventions, of course.
Good. Let me just hide these ones that we already replied. I saw there were some questions later to Martin. Let me find a few ones here. Maybe this is for all speakers. We can maybe try to answer together. I'd love to get an idea. Advocates of big data research state that with the amount of data available nowadays, it is more promising to look at the correlation and causation. Let the data speak for us. This will somehow remove the inherent bias of our models. What is your opinion on this criticism? Maybe Martin, you haven't answered any. Do you want to
yes,
answer this question?
I think it's very interesting if you work, let's say, in public policy. There will always be biases. I mean, you have to propose measures to politicians. Politicians have, let's say, mental models, which will be suited or not. So I also think that there's lots of data available, of course, but we all know about fake news and stuff like this, etc. Data won't provide the answer on what to do. there's also interesting, let's say, psychological dynamics going on with politicians who just wants to wait before the data presents the solution itself. But on the other hand, the issue is that if you want to change things in society, which is basically what politics should be working on to change it for the better, you'll have to have an opinion, a structure, a theory of change, let's say a policy perspective on how things will work if you adopt, let's say, certain measures. Data won't help you by that. You have to formulate, if you're a politician or if you're trying to inform the political debate, you'll have to think of structures which will drive the change, the social change, which David is also referring to. You can't do without it. You may be, let's say, neoliberal, you may be a social democrat or a proponent of other, let's say, political ideologies. But also you'll have, let's say, automatically you will need a theory of change, of how society should work, what will be the structure driving, whether it's market principles or, let's say, equal sharing or traditional values or anything. You will have this mental map, how society should work and which is the gap between how it works, which you observe, and how this should be changed. So how come there's no mental models anymore if there's only data? How would things work? How would change in society work if we would say the data says that some people say there's no structural racism, as David was referring to, which is an issue in, let's say, the mental models. Would it work? There's always mental models and, let's say, ideologies or mental models, or there's always gaps between observed situations and proposed or idealized situations, which people will try to manage, to close. So I think there might be, of course, our models will be biased, system dynamic models are biased, mental models of politicians are biased, mental models of people who suffer from, let's say, being marginalized. They also have mental models which are, to a certain extent, limited. We all have. That's how human mind works. And we all know that's not made for, let's say, a long-term complex feedback. It's made for, let's say, immediate satisfaction of basic needs. That's biology. So I think the criticism that the data will provide the solutions or the policy measures in which we want to close the gap between the observed situation and the proposed or the idealized situation, the data won't do it. We always have this mental model, this image of an ideal and the image of what should be changed. And there's an underlying model structure deeply embedded in our mind.
I'm curious to know what David has to say on this, because he works a lot with the qualitative data. And can you add anything on this, David?
Yeah, thank you for asking, Fernando. One, I very much agree with everything that Martin has said. And both the last chapter in my book and a blog post I have on the Bridgeway Partners website has the observation that systems thinking, it's not just what you think. This is not just cognitive work. In order to do this work effectively, I believe there is an emotional component. We need to have emotional intelligence, understand how attached people are to the way they think about the world, no matter what the data is. There's a behavioral component where we need to learn to work intelligently with a social change architecture of organizing stakeholders into effective, motivated movements for change. And ultimately, to me, there's a spiritual component to this work as well. So it's not just cognitive, and data alone is never going to be enough.
Thank you, David. Kaveh, do you want to add on anything on this, or should I just move on to the
Just
next?
just
Go
a
ahead.
quick point that I want to emphasize the storytelling power of system dynamics, which also came up in David's presentation, which I think really sets it apart from sheer data-oriented methods. As you know, through causal loop diagrams and through feedback thinking, we can tell interesting stories of how things work and how things would pan out. And these stories are what can really grasp the human mind. So that is, for me, one of the key selling points of SD, if not the main one. And the other thing is that data-driven methods, they normally fail to anticipate changes in the trends. So they normally behave in an extrapolated manner. If something has been growing, it will probably continue to grow, and so on. Whereas with structural thinking, we can tell a story and we can also anticipate potential reversals in trends. So those are two important advantages that you could argue for SD, I think.
Thanks, Kaveh. I think we have time for maybe 2 other questions. Do you guys see anything that you'd like to answer here? I think Rebecca wanted to know a little bit of, she was curious to why you leave out the link polarities in your models. As a system dynamicist, this makes it harder to validate your assumptions. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, thanks for asking. It builds very much on the point that Kaveh just made. I'm interested in developing these, showing these models in order to be able to tell stories, very human stories, often of well-intentioned people doing the wrong things or things that undermine what they ultimately say they want to accomplish. Putting the polarities in the final stories that I then communicate back to the stakeholders. I want to have a minimum of systems jargon and a maximum of recognizable language that those people will understand. So I use labels like quick fixes, fundamental solutions, vicious cycles, things that are very easy for people to get. And I deliberately take out pluses and minuses or S's and O's, which are then just going to slow people down and confuse people about the, if you will, the magic underneath the story.
Thanks, David. Let's pick another question here. Anything that you would like to answer? Maybe this one. This is not specific for one presenter. How about Forrester's urban dynamics insights? He found that an imbalance of housing and job availability creates poverty. This could apply to, especially to temporary shelters, because they may normally not be put into areas where jobs are available, but could maybe even to affordable permanent housing. Can maybe Martin, do you, is this question clear for you? Do you want to start answering it?
Yes, I think you should think about why Professor Forrester started with urban dynamics anyway. I guess he was, or at least that's what I think. He was focused on, let's say, the differences between, let's say, urban growth in early stages of urban development, and then the stagnation and deterioration phase. So basically what he did was trying to understand the dynamics, the structures, causing that behavior. It's very well visible in, let's say, many North American cities, but I can name examples in Dutch cities as well, and I guess all over the place. But the focus, the purpose of his model was to explain this boom and bust cycles of these cities. Was he focusing on, let's say, explaining the dynamics, how people get into homelessness situation and how housing first programs will help them out? I don't think so. So basically, of course, the basic tenet is in urban dynamics that if you want, let's say, economically boost a city, then in the long run you need to, let's say, remove, let's say, deteriorated housing and replace it with new businesses. This very much helps, let's say, to the overall urban economy. But the focus on, let's say, these temporary shelters is completely different. As David was trying to explain, these people need, let's say, to have a safe haven, a stable home, in order not to get into, let's say, disadvantaged situations. So I guess the modeling purposes are quite different. And even if, let's say, the urban dynamic story is very telling, it does not automatically relate to the problem which David was proposing. So I find it a bit difficult, and of course, temporary shelters will take up room as well in cities. That's true, but the focus of what people are trying to explain are so different. And of course, I guess in all presentations, more or less visible, you have seen that there's competition on land between businesses, urban dynamics, permanent housing, social housing, or investment housing, whatever. Of course, these are all, let's say, structures which may come up in different types of models. But if you're modeling, let's say, urban bust and boom cycles, as Professor Forster did, or let's say the role of a home in homelessness or disadvantaged situations, or let's say the different dynamics of housing affordability or whatever, the focus will be different. But of course, you should take into account very much that you're modeling problematic behavior and not, let's say, you're not mostly modeling the system. You want to explain the dynamics. And I guess Professor Forster explains different dynamics. Now I don't hear you.
Thank you so much, Martin. Yes, we're a little bit over time, so I'll just like to thank you, Martin, David, and Kaveh to being here today. We do have a lot of questions. I'm going to share a file with the presenters, and they hopefully can answer these questions that we're not able to answer here live. And we usually create a blog post, so you can go to the Wisdom blog on our website and find the questions that we didn't have time to answer here live. Just one more slide here that I have. If you have time, I sent an email. You can find in your inbox a link to our survey. And I think, Monique, if you go to our chat on Slack, you can find the link also, if you could place here in the chat to give us feedback. It's really important for us. It helps us to improve. So you can check your email for that. Thank you again, Martin, David, and Kaveh. I really hope to see you guys around. And yeah, thank you so much, Rebecca. Do you have any final considerations to say if you're still here? I'm not sure if you're still here.
Yep, I am here. I just want to thank everyone. This was really informative and a topic that I am very interested in. If anyone here would be interested in starting a special interest group on this topic, I would love to see it happen. You can get in touch with Fernando or myself.
Thank you, Rebecca. Today.
Okay, thank you, everyone.
Thank you for organizing.
Thank you.